Hi, this is Peter, and this is going to be a short video to explain the results of the flow analysis that I've been doing on the Raptor Airframe when comparing it to the Cirrus SR22. So the reason that I wanted to do this was, first of all, to prove that the airframe that I had designed here would provide the same amount of lift as the Cirrus, because we're going for the same max gross weight of about 34 to 3,600 pounds. So that was the first purpose of this, and the second was to just prove again that the design was much less draggy than the Cirrus, and we're going to ultimately be able to get the performance that I've been saying on the website. So as you see here, I've got just the basic Raptor airframe here, and I've gone and made it so you can adjust the elevator there depending on for each particular flow analysis, so you can adjust it up and down in relation to the pitch of the aircraft, so you're getting reasonable numbers from this flow simulation. And if I switch over here, you'll see I also have the Cirrus SR22 that I've modeled here with the landing gear on it as well, and you see I've modeled the flaps for the slow speed calculations, and of course modeled the elevator as well. So I don't know the exact angles for the elevator for the different pitch attitudes, so I've kind of had to estimate that for both aircraft. And for the slow speed handling of the Cirrus, I did the calculation there at 70 knots indicated with 20 degrees of flaps, and then all the other calculations are done with no flaps in there. And obviously on the Raptor there aren't any flaps, so I've just basically done set the elevator to what I would think would be close to what it would be depending on the angle of attack. So that's kind of how it works. And then the way SolidWorks works with its simulations is you basically set up a simulation, you adjust the airframe to whatever angle attack you want, set the airspeed and a bunch of other different settings, and choose the level of calculation. In other words, how long it will take, how detailed the analysis will be, and then it will give you the results. And the results that I've been coming back with are mainly the lift and drag, and also the pitching moment of the aircraft, just so I could see that it wasn't being pitched violently in one direction or another. So that's how all the analysis is done, and each analysis can take, depending on the level of the resolution, can take anywhere from 5 minutes up to 45 minutes or more. So it's taken me a long time to go through all these numbers. And one thing I found, I basically established a baseline whereby at a given angle of attack for the Cirrus, which was basically 0 degrees, at 185 knots indicated, which is actually slightly faster than the max speed of the Cirrus, I managed to get the flow simulation to tell me it was putting out exactly 1,600 pounds of lift, and give me the corresponding drag for that as well. And then likewise I got the same number of about 3,600 pounds of lift with the Raptor, with about 0.65 degrees nose down attitude, and at the same airspeed. So that was my baseline, and having that, I sort of worked down the scale backwards all the way down to 70 knots indicated for the Cirrus. And what was interesting was the flow simulation in SolidWorks doesn't give me a very good number at that point. It gives me a low amount of lift for, I think the angle of attack I used on there was about 7 degrees, and I think it was about 6 degrees, I think. And then on the Raptor I used slightly more angle of attack on there because it doesn't have flaps. And the Raptor, the minimum speed I put was 75 knots, and you'll see I've charted all this, and it's up on the website. So that's kind of an explanation of how I did everything. And so even though SolidWorks was giving me numbers in the low speed range that didn't match the amount of lift that I was looking for in pounds, it gives the lift in newtons, but I was converting to pounds. I wasn't really worried if it didn't give me the exact numbers, because really all I'm doing is comparing one airframe to another, and we know what the Cirrus can do. And so I was just trying to use those numbers from the Cirrus, extrapolate that against the Raptor to determine what the Raptor is capable of. So that kind of covers the introduction, and in a second I'll show you some of the analysis results in graphical form. Okay, here's the analysis of the pressure distribution on the airframe, and this is done at 75 knots indicated. So you can see across the Raptor it's fairly evenly distributed, and I've used a set scale here, and you'll see in a second on the Cirrus the same scale, you see different pressure distribution. So you can see here the fuselage is developing a lot of lift there because that low pressure over the roof there, and so that obviously helps with the lift that we need. And so you're not literally wasting all that space of the fuselage and not developing any lift from it. So that's kind of nice. And notice too that there aren't any places on the leading edges of the wings or anywhere else where we're getting into orange or red pressure distribution, and that's mainly because of the swept wing design and also the slightly swept canard design. You don't end up with anything here. If you have a straight edge canard, if you looked at the other charts that I've had on the website there that show the aerial analysis, that creates a larger pressure increase when the airframe gets to that packet of air, and so you'll end up with a lot more pressure there. So a swept leading edge is obviously a better way to do it, although you've got to be careful with that, especially with canards, to make sure that you don't sweep it too much, because you can affect the lift of the foil. So let me switch over here and I'll show you what the Cirrus looks like. So here you can see the Cirrus. Again, it's fairly even distribution, although you've got areas of super low pressure here right above the wing, and that's where a lot of the lift is being generated. But notice too on the leading edges here you have areas that are orange, and so those are areas of high pressure and obviously creating more drag. And also too you see there's areas here of slightly higher pressure on the landing gear, which is going to create a little bit more drag as well. So you can see from those comparisons that in general the Raptor has a much sort of more even pressure distribution over the airframe. So next I'll show you a little bit more about the flow analysis here. Okay, so here we have the analysis showing the airframe again at 175 knots, and the colors represent the vorticity or turbulence around the airframe. So starting at blue, which is 0, and I set it to a maximum of 60 here so we can sort of accentuate where the turbulence is coming. You can see here coming off and this is again, it's a side view, but it's in 3 dimensions, so this is the easiest way to look at. You can only look at the side really, and the front view on this, otherwise it just gets so cluttered it's hard to see it in 3 dimensions. So I'll show you the front view in a minute, but you can see here the red areas coming off the top of the wing there where the lift is being generated is creating turbulence, and you have a little bit of the greener sort of colors, and then down here from the nose gear, and then down here around the main gear you see there's some red lines and stuff being generated there. So that the landing gear, even though it's there and it's supposed to be cleaned up and all smoothed out, and that it's creating turbulence, which is creating drag, and that's what slows down the Cirrus. So it only has that maximum top speed of 185 true, and obviously except not pressurized, it can't get up to altitude. Well, I guess the turbocharged one can, but it's not pressurized. So let's see, I'll switch over here and you can see how the Raptor looks, and it has the same type of problems and stuff. There's turbulence coming off the canard there because it's generating lift, and likewise off the main wing, but it's fairly smooth with respect to the whole airframe. There's nothing sticking out that's creating unnecessary turbulence. You're just getting what you need for lift. And because the canard aircraft doesn't have a flap system, the main wing needs to have more area in general to generate that lift at low speed, and so ultimately at high speed it is not quite as efficient because it could be smaller, but it's not adjustable, so it is generating some drag there. But again, because you don't have this landing gear sticking out, and just in general because of the shape of the Raptor, you'll see it's generating less drag there, and you'll see from the chart there that these numbers come out from SolidWorks when you do the simulation. So here next I'll show you what it looks like with the front view of the drag simulation here. Okay, so here's the Cirrus with the front on view, and so there you can more easily see where the turbulence is being generated here. So these are all red marks here where turbulence is being generated from the lift over the wing, and you can see some of the red marks around here where the landing gear, and obviously some of the green marks. And so there's a bunch of sort of generalized disturbance around the landing gear here, and then you've got the disturbance from the lift on the wing and then all the way out, and then underneath here you've got, well, over here you've got your vortexes being generated from the wingtips on either side. And it's kind of interesting because they don't really use any sort of tips on the Cirrus, and they probably could and make some improvement to minimize those. And then so you can kind of see that there's also some sort of orange colors here, isn't that? So there's kind of like a fairly messy kind of bit of disturbance all around here, for various different reasons, the wingtips and the landing gear. Much of that is what's causing all this sort of swirl, and obviously all this turbulence creates drag, and that's what we're trying to eliminate. So let me switch over here to the Raptor, and you'll see it's a much cleaner kind of look. Even though we have the winglets on here, they are still generating a vortex that sort of trails behind them, and you'll see that in a minute when I animate this. And then you're just getting sort of generalized turbulence because of lift, and most of that sort of trailing. But yeah, it's fairly clean with respect to, or when compared with the Cirrus, and that's why, and you'll see on the chart there, and all the numbers that have from all the simulations I've run, pretty much across the board, the drag for the same amount of lift, the drag is reduced by about 15% on the Raptor when compared with the Cirrus. So that's quite a large improvement, and that's why we're going to get the performance that I was hoping out of this airframe. So next I'll switch over and I'll show you the animation of how this all works. Okay, so here we're looking from the rear of the aircraft, and you'll see it animates the flow, and obviously the colors change with respect to the turbulence being created or the vorticity. So you'll see here, if I zoom in a little bit here, you can kind of see what's happening as the air comes down the airframe from the front to the back here, comes over the fuselage there, and sort of swirls around, and then of course it animates for another 20 feet or so behind the aircraft. So that what you see at the end there is what's happening trailing the aircraft. So here you can see all the red lines, and that's basically where the turbulence is being generated from the lift there. And again, this is at 170 knots indicated. So if I zoom out here and focus on the wingtip, you'll see here how the vortices are generated as the air crosses over the wing. It starts to swirl around like that. So it's kind of neat to be able to see that. So anyway, and then also too, if you look at the landing gear, you can see how as the air goes around it, it creates that turbulence, which is obviously creating the drag that is unavoidable with a fixed gear. And maybe it doesn't contribute a lot, but if you can eliminate it, then why not? So anyway, that's kind of how it looks if you're watching the animation of what happened there. And I'll switch over here and you can see it how it looks on the Raptor. Okay, so here we are with the Raptor, and you can see the same type of thing we saw before there, and we'll just watch it as the air comes over the fuselage there and over the top surface of the wing, and you can see it swirls around a little bit there, but there's only sort of a minimal, there's nothing sort of hanging down creating extra drag. And the larger fuselage isn't really causing any sorts of problems and creating any larger turbulence, because it narrows in nicely, like a smooth kind of transition from small to large back to small again up the tail. So, and then you look at the wingtips here, and you'll see I think the vortex is pretty much coming from here as opposed to here, but you get a similar sort of effect, and I think it's kind of unavoidable. Anywhere there's generating lift, you're going to create a vortex, and this is set up to generate minimal lift. It's a very thin, narrow airfoil, so it's not going to create as large a vortex as what you would have just on straight out on the wingtip over here. So that kind of gives you the summary there, just sort of showing it how the flow is going over the airframe. And it's kind of neat to be able to see that and see if there's any problem areas that are creating any sort of weird turbulence, but it looks fairly clean, at least in my eyes. I don't think I could improve on it anymore at this point. So next I'm going to show you some of the data here, or at least the plotted data that I have and explain what that tells us. Okay, so here's a little bit of the data that I collected with all the simulations I was running, and just to give you an example of what comes out of SolidWorks here and what I was selecting. So here I've got the Raptor at 185 knots and level 6 simulation, which is fairly high. The angle of attack was negative 0.65 degrees, and this is the data that you can export out of there, and obviously there's a lot more, but all I was choosing here was the first line is the lift, the second is the drag, and the next is the rotational moment, pitching moment. And what I did over here, these numbers are all in newtons here, so I'm taking the average value and I'm just multiplying that by 0.225 to convert it to pounds. And so the lift here is 3,602 pounds, and the drag, corresponding drag, is 1,616 pounds, and the lift to drag ratio was 2.22, and again that was 185 knots. And for the Cirrus, same type of simulation, level 6, and this was 0 degree angle, and I experimented with different angles, and that was the one that produced the number that I was looking for in terms of lift. So I got 3,649, so almost the same amount of lift in pounds, and the drag was 1,913 pounds. So you see the lift to drag ratio there is much lower, 1.9, and obviously the drag is higher. So it turns out here in these numbers over here, the side, basically what I did was I normalized the drag based upon the lift to get a 1,637 normalized against the Cirrus Air, and then I took that number and compared it with this, and I see that it's 85% of that. So the 1637 is 85%. So we've got a 15% reduction in drag. So I have loads of numbers that I've done on this to get all the information, but next let me show you this chart that I have. Okay, so this is the chart that I generated from the data, and I just didn't put all the data on here because it would have got like too messy. So I took some, there's my initial point there at 185 for both aircraft, and then I did the minimum or the stall speed on the Cirrus there. I did it down at 70 knots, and I did 75 knots for the Raptor because it'll have a slightly higher minimum flying speed or stall speed, even though it doesn't stall, minimum flying speed. And then I plotted, so that's the lift up here for both, and you see I also plotted some extra ones in here, so that's at 175 knots for the Raptor, and these are high ones here, 215 and 235 knots again for the Raptor, just because I wanted to throw some extra numbers in. I didn't think there was no point of doing that on the Cirrus because it doesn't go that fast. So really what I wanted to do, and as I was telling you before, ultimately it would have been nice to be able to prove that I could have 3,600 pounds across the board here, but for some reason I can't get SolidWorks to give me that, so I think I'm doing something wrong with my calculations or whatever. But the fact that I could prove this baseline of 3,600 pounds of lift here at what would be the maximum cruise speed was really the point that I needed as a starting point. And so really it doesn't really matter how SolidWorks calculate this. I'm just really comparing one airframe to the other and using that to determine the percentage improvement of the Raptor over the Cirrus. So here you can see with the drag curves here, and the red one is the Cirrus and the orange one is the Raptor, and you can see pretty much across the board there it's a 15% decrease in drag. So what I did next was I looked at the book for the Cirrus SR22 and went through a bunch of different numbers that they have there, and they all pretty much agreed with what I was calculating here in terms of the drag. So what I did was I looked in the book and I saw that for 170 horsepower from their 310 horsepower engine, which is the 55% power, and it didn't really matter what altitude I chose, the indicated airspeed for this particular example I chose was 149 knots. So what I did was I took 149 here and I went up here to the chart and I ended up with about 1,250 pounds of drag. And so the 1,250 pounds of drag for 170 horsepower works out, if you divide 170 into 1,250, you end up with around about 0.14 pounds. 1.4 per pound of drag is the amount of horsepower that you need to overcome drag based upon the numbers coming out of SolidWorks. Maybe that's not in the real world, but that's what's coming out of SolidWorks when I'm comparing these airframes to each other. So knowing that number, I can then work onto the Raptor drag curve to figure out some numbers of how much horsepower we'll need to get to the airspeeds that we're looking at. So the example I've given in here in the description here is, let's say we want to do 200 knots indicated, so we come over here and then we move up the chart here and we see that we're about 1800 or 1850 pounds of drag, and if you multiply that out by 0.14 you end up with about 260 horsepower. So to get 200 knots indicated at any altitude we need 260 horsepower, and the Adept engine that we're looking at for the Raptor is going to quite readily put out, because it's turbocharged, is going to quite readily put out 260 horsepower at altitude, or at any altitude, including all the way up to 25,000 feet. So at 25,000 feet, doing 200 knots indicated gets you a 300 knot aircraft, and of course, you know, we can do even better than that. And as you see, you know, you can use, if you want to do it yourself, you can use this chart to figure out, well, how fast you want to go and how much horsepower do you need. And if you're using the Pratt & Whitney engine, you won't have any problems getting 230 knots indicated, because I think the number when I worked it out, it was about 400 horsepower gets you 230 knots indicated, and you can do some math yourself to figure it out, but that's basically how it works. You just choose the airspeed that you want to go and look up the chart here, go over to here to see how many pounds of force need to be eliminated by the horsepower of the engine, and then multiply that by 0.14, and that'll tell you how many horsepower that you need. Of course, you could work it the other way too if you wanted to. Choose how much horsepower you have and look over on the chart and figure out how fast you're going to go. And I think I did a calculation for getting 250 knots indicated. You would need about 450 horsepower, I think was the number that I came up with. But again, you could extrapolate this chart and kind of figure it out for yourself. And again, these numbers may vary. They could vary by as much as plus or minus 5%, but I think they're fairly accurate, because every time I went with the Cirrus here and took the book numbers for 65, 75 and 55% and used the indicated airspeeds that they had provided at altitude by, well, they provide true airspeeds, but I was using the calculator to go backwards to indicated airspeeds, and I was plugging that in, and I was literally hitting the chart every time and getting the same point, around about the same 0.14 number. It might vary a little bit. Sometimes it was 0.135 and other times it was closer to 0.15, but it's somewhere in there. And so I think I've achieved what I wanted to do with this airframe. We're going to have a 300 knot aircraft that's going to get there on about 260 horsepower, and that's actually better than what I thought, because I thought we were going to need about 300 horsepower, but we should be able to get there at 25,000 feet on about 260 horsepower if everything goes good. So, and one of the other things that I was interested in looking at on this chart, and everybody kind of knows that the drag increases with the square of your speed. So I was doing some calculations here and looking at this and going, well, it's not quite that, because I did some numbers in here. If you're 70 knots over here and you're going to 230 knots, the drag here, if it's just under 400 here, it should be going up to about 3,900 here. And then I quickly realized, well, this is combined drag, so it's not just drag from the airframe. The drag down here is increased because of the extra lift that's being generated. So that's why the curve isn't quite as high as it would be if it was just a drag curve, because it's, like I said, it's a combination drag and lift. Anyway, that kind of explains, I think, everything that I wanted to say. And I guess the last thing, the numbers that we're getting from Adept telling us that the engine that they have now is putting out, I think, around about 0.37 specific fuel consumption. So if you're putting out about 270 horsepower, 260 horsepower, you'll be burning about 16 gallons an hour. And at that airspeed in the Raptor, you'll be doing 300 knots or 345 miles an hour, and you'll be averaging about 21 miles to the gallon. And of course, if you pull the power back a lot, that's when you'll get even even better. And we were doing some numbers yesterday and managed to see numbers about 27.5 miles to the gallon if you pulled your indicated airspeed back to, I think we were choosing like about 170 knots indicated, which would be about 250 knots true, I believe. I can't remember, that's just off the top of my head, but anyway, we were seeing about 27 miles to the gallon. So that's kind of nice, and it's going to be better in your car. And if you think about the fact that you're flying in a straight line instead of driving around roads and off your beaten path, you're actually doing much better than 27 miles to the gallon, probably more like 35 when comparing it to a car. So it's going to be environmentally friendly as well. Anyway, I'll probably do another video at some point, and I hope you enjoy this one. Thanks.